Darkness had fallen upon Cedar Creek, blanketing the quaint houses and manicured lawns in an unsettling stillness. A lone figure, Emily Carson, burst out of her front door, her chest heaving with panic. Her eyes darted from side to side, wide with terror, her breath catching in ragged gasps. She didn't scream, but her silence was more unsettling than any shriek. Two neighbours, startled by the commotion, emerged from their homes. "Emily! What's wrong? Do you need help?" one called out, concern etched on his face. Emily hesitated for a split second, her lips parting as if to speak, but the words wouldn't come. She shook her head violently, her eyes flickering towards something unseen behind her. Turning away from her concerned neighbours, Emily sprinted towards her car parked at the curb. She fumbled with her keys, her hands trembling, before managing to unlock the door. With a slam and the screech of tyres, she sped off into the night, leaving her neighbours standing in the pool of light from the street lamp, a mixture of worry and confusion clouding their faces. Emily was gone, vanished into the darkness, leaving behind more questions than answers. The roar of the ocean waves crashing against the shore was the only sound that broke the silence. Emily sat hunched on the cold sand, the salty air whipping strands of hair across her face. Her eyes, red-rimmed and filled with a haunting despair, stared out at the vast expanse of the dark, churning water. In her hand, she clutched her cell phone, the screen glowing faintly in the darkness. With a trembling finger, she pressed the call button. The phone rang, each tone echoing the frantic beating of her heart. "Hello?" a familiar voice answered, tinged with sleep. "Mum, Dad, it's me, Emily," she choked out, her voice barely a whisper. "Emily, what is it, darling? What's wrong?" Her mother's voice, now thick with concern, filled her ear. I needed to hear your voices," Emily stammered, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. "I love you both so much. Please tell everyone. Tell everyone I love..." Her voice cracked, the words catching in her throat. Before she could finish her sentence, the line went dead. The phone slipped from her grasp, falling into the sand. Emily remained motionless, her gaze fixed on the unforgiving darkness of the ocean, a single tear tracing a path through the sand on her cheek. The crashing waves seemed to whisper her name, a chilling prelude to the horror that awaited her. Dawn broke over Cedar Creek, casting the beach in a soft, ethereal light. The gentle lapping of waves against the shore stood in stark contrast to the gruesome scene that unfolded before the eyes of a lone jogger. Emily's lifeless body lay sprawled on the sand, her once vibrant eyes staring vacantly at the cloudless sky. Her limbs were contorted at unnatural angles, her skin ghastly pale against the backdrop of the golden sand. The jogger, his breath catching in his throat, stumbled back in horror, fumbling for his phone to call the police. The news of Emily's demise spread through the small town like wildfire, leaving a trail of shock and disbelief in its wake. Whispers of a curse, murmurs of something sinister lurking in the shadows began to circulate, casting a pall over Cedar Creek's once peaceful ambience. The police, their faces grim, combed the beach for clues, but the evidence was scant. Emily's phone, its screen cracked, lay buried in the sand, offering no explanation for her erratic behaviour or the brutality of her death. The townspeople, their faces etched with a mixture of grief and fear, could only watch helplessly as the investigation seemed to reach a dead end. The bustling crowds of the city seemed a world away from the quiet unease that had settled over Cedar Creek. Laura, a bright and cheerful college student, sat in a crowded movie theatre, her boyfriend Derek's arm casually draped around her shoulder. The air was thick with the smell of popcorn and the anticipation of the latest horror flick. As the opening credits rolled, Derek leaned closer to Laura, his breath tickling her ear. "See that girl in the yellow dress?" he whispered, his voice barely audible above the soundtrack. "The one by the snack counter?" Laura, her gaze scanning the crowd, frowned. "I don't see anyone in a yellow dress," she replied, her brow furrowing in confusion. Derek's grip on her arm tightened slightly. "She's right there," he insisted, his voice taking on an urgent tone. "She's staring right at us." Laura, now feeling a prickle of unease, turned back towards the snack counter. The crowd had thinned out, but there was still no sign of anyone in a yellow dress. A chill ran down her spine, sending goosebumps erupting on her arms. Derek's insistence on something she couldn't see was starting to creep her out. The movie, once a source of entertainment, now felt oppressive, each scene seeming to amplify Laura's growing sense of dread. She couldn't shake off the feeling of being watched, of an unseen presence lurking just beyond her field of vision. Derek, his face pale and drawn, seemed to share her unease, his eyes darting nervously around the theatre. "Derek, let's just go," Laura whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "This isn't fun anymore." Derek nodded curtly, his usual playful demeanour replaced by a tense silence. As they rose from their seats and made their way towards the exit, Laura felt a cold spot on the back of her neck, as if an icy breath had grazed her skin. Outside the theatre, the cool night air did little to dispel the stifling atmosphere that had settled over them. Derek hailed a cab, his hand shaking as he held up his arm. As they climbed into the back seat, Laura stole one last glance back at the theatre. For a fleeting moment she thought she saw a figure standing in the shadows across the street, a flash of yellow fabric disappearing into the darkness. Her heart pounded in her chest, a sense of foreboding washing over her. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. And as the cab pulled away from the curb, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had stumbled into a nightmare from which there was no escape. The cab ride was a blur to Laura, the unsettling events at the theatre replaying in her mind like a broken film projector. Derek, usually a talkative and engaging companion, remained uncharacteristically silent, his gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the window. His silence, heavy with unspoken words, amplified Laura's growing unease. As the cab pulled up outside Laura's apartment building, Derek finally turned to her, his expression grave. "Laura," he began, his voice barely a whisper, "I need to tell you something. Something important. Something terrifying." His words hung in the air, heavy with ominous portent, sending a shiver down Laura's spine. Laura's heart skipped a beat. Derek's unusual demeanour, his cryptic warnings, had planted a seed of fear in her mind, a seed that was rapidly taking root. "What is it, Derek?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "What's going on?" She searched his face for a clue, a hint of reassurance, but found none. Derek took a deep breath, as if steeling himself for a difficult task. "It all started a few weeks ago," he began, his voice low and hesitant. "I met a girl at a bar. We hit it off, ended up back at her place." He trailed off, his gaze dropping to his hands, which were clasped tightly in his lap. "Derek, please," Laura urged, her anxiety growing with each passing second. "Just tell me what happened." Derek hesitated for a moment longer, then met her gaze, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and resignation. "I woke up the next morning," he continued, his voice barely audible above the hum of the cab's engine, "and she was gone. But before she left, she told me she had passed something on to me, a curse." The word hung in the confined space of the cab, heavy with dread. Laura's breath caught in her throat. A curse? It sounded like something out of a horror movie, too fantastical, too absurd to be real. Yet Derek's palpable fear, The genuine terror etched on his face belied any notion of fabrication. "What kind of curse?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "She said I would be followed," Derek replied, his gaze distant as if reliving a nightmare, "followed by someone that only I could see, something evil, something that couldn't be stopped." He paused, his chest heaving as he struggled to regain his composure. "She said it could take any form," Derek continued, his voice tight with fear. "Anyone at all. But it would always be there, always watching, always approaching." Laura, her mind reeling from the sheer improbability of it all, could only stare at him, her own fear mirroring his. As if to punctuate his words, Derek suddenly grabbed Laura's arm, his grip surprisingly strong. "Look!" he hissed, his voice urgent. "Can you see her by that lamppost?" Laura, her heart pounding in her chest, followed his gaze. At first she saw nothing, and then, as her eyes adjusted to the dim light, she thought she could make out a figure standing beneath the flickering glow of the street lamp. A woman, her back to them, her long hair cascading down her back. She was completely naked, her pale skin glowing eerily in the darkness. Laura gasped, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle a scream. The woman turned, her head slowly pivoting on her neck as if she were a puppet manipulated by unseen strings. Laura couldn't make out her features in the darkness, but she could sense her gaze, cold and predatory, fixed upon them. The cab lurched forward, pulling away from the curb, and the woman vanished from sight. Laura sank back into her seat, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. Derek, his face ashen, released her arm, his grip loosening as if all the strength had drained from his body. "You see," he whispered, his voice hoarse with terror, "you see, it's real." "We need to go back to my place," Derek muttered, his voice trembling slightly as he gave the driver a new address. Laura, still reeling from the encounter with the naked woman, could only nod mutely, her mind struggling to process the impossible situation she found herself in. The cab ride seemed to stretch on forever, the silence broken only by the rhythmic ticking of the meter and the pounding of Laura's own heart. As soon as the cab pulled away from the curb, Derek grabbed Laura's hand, his grip surprisingly strong. "Listen to me," he said urgently, his voice low and intense. "There's only one way to get rid of it, to survive." His words hung in the air, heavy with dread and a chilling sense of finality. Laura's breath hitched in her throat. "What do you mean?" she whispered, her voice barely audible above the pounding of her own heart. Derek took a deep breath, as if steeling himself for a difficult task. "You have to pass it on," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "You have to find someone else, someone to take it from you." Laura stared at him in horror, the full weight of his words crashing down on her like a tidal wave. "But how?" she stammered, her mind rebelling against the sheer depravity of the situation. Derek's eyes, filled with a mixture of fear and desperation, met hers. "The same way it was passed to me," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "Through intimacy." Derek's apartment was a small, sparsely furnished studio, the air thick with the stale smell of cigarettes and unfulfilled promises. Laura sat on the edge of the bed, her body trembling, her mind a maelstrom of fear and confusion. Derek paced back and forth in the cramped space, his agitation palpable. "It has to be soon," he said, his voice tight with urgency. "The longer you wait, the stronger it gets, the more persistent." He stopped pacing and turned to face her, his expression a mixture of pleading and desperation. "Please, Laura," he said, his voice breaking slightly, "you have to do this, for both of us." Laura closed her eyes, trying to block out the fear that threatened to consume her. She knew what Derek was asking of her, the terrible choice he was forcing upon her. Pass on the curse, condemn another soul to the same living nightmare, or become another victim of its relentless pursuit. Time seemed to lose all meaning as Laura drifted in a haze of fear and despair. Derek's words echoed in her ears, a constant reminder of the impossible situation she found herself in. And then, as if in a dream, she felt his touch, his hands on her body, his lips on her skin. Laura woke with a gasp, her body cold and stiff, her mind still foggy from the drugged sleep. She was alone in Derek's apartment. The only sound, the faint hum of the refrigerator and the relentless ticking of the clock on the wall. She sat up, pushing herself away from the wall, her hand instinctively reaching for the spot where Derek had injected her with the chloroform. Panic surged through her as she realized the full weight of what had transpired. Derek was gone. He had used her, passed on the curse, and then vanished into the night, leaving her to face the consequences of his actions. She stumbled to her feet, her legs unsteady beneath her, and made her way to the window. The first rays of dawn were just beginning to paint the sky with hues of orange and pink, but the beauty of the sunrise did little to alleviate the sense of dread that had settled over Laura like a shroud. She was alone, hunted, and the worst was yet to come. As she stared out at the city waking below, a figure caught her eye, a man, tall and imposing, his features obscured by the shadows of a nearby building. He stood across the street, his gaze fixed on her apartment, a chilling smile playing on his lips. Laura's breath hitched in her throat. She couldn't see his face, not clearly, but she didn't need to. She knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that it was him, the entity, and he had found her. The bustling campus, alive with the rhythm of student life, provided little comfort to Laura. The weight of Derek's revelation, the chilling encounter at his apartment, hung over her like a suffocating shroud. Every face in the crowd seemed to morph into the entity, every shadow a potential hiding place for the unseen terror that now pursued her. She had tried to tell her friends, Megan, Charlie and Sarah, about the curse, about the entity that only she could see, but the words caught in her throat, choked by the sheer absurdity of it all. How could she possibly explain something so utterly unbelievable, so deeply unsettling, without sounding utterly insane? The old oak tree at the heart of the campus, once a place of solace and quiet contemplation, now filled Laura with a sense of dread. As she approached it, her pace quickening, she noticed a figure sitting on the bench beneath its sprawling branches. An elderly woman, her frail body hunched over a worn leather handbag, her silver hair catching the glint of the afternoon sun. Laura's breath hitched in her throat. The woman's back was to her, but Laura could sense her gaze, cold and piercing, boring into her very soul. She stopped dead in her tracks, her heart pounding in her chest, her mind screaming at her to run, to escape while she still had the chance. Panic surged through Laura, threatening to overwhelm her. She spun on her heel and fled, her backpack bouncing awkwardly against her back, her breath catching in ragged gasps. The image of the elderly woman, her face shrouded in shadow, her gaze filled with a chilling intensity, seared itself into her mind. She couldn't outrun it. She couldn't hide from it. Derek's words echoed in her ears, a constant reminder of the inescapable truth. The entity would always find her. It was only a matter of time. Laura's friends, their faces etched with concern, found her huddled in a secluded corner of the library, her body trembling, her eyes wide with terror. She had to tell them. She had to make them understand. With a trembling voice, Laura recounted the events of the past few days, the chilling revelation, the terrifying encounters, the impossible choice that had been forced upon her. To her surprise, her friends listened patiently, their initial skepticism giving way to a growing sense of unease as they pieced together the fragments of Laura's fragmented narrative. "We have to find Derek," Megan said, her voice firm, her expression resolute. "He knows more than he's letting on. He might be able to help." Laura nodded mutely, clinging to the sliver of hope that her sister's words offered. Together the four friends set out to unravel the mystery of the curse, their search leading them down a labyrinthine path of half-truths, dead ends, and terrifying encounters. Hours turned into days as they scoured the internet, poring over old news articles, missing person reports, and obscure online forums dedicated to the paranormal. The entity, it seemed, had left a trail of broken lives and unexplained deaths in its wake, its existence whispered in hushed tones, its true nature shrouded in mystery. Their search led them to a small town on the outskirts of the city, a place where time seemed to stand still, where the air was thick with the scent of pine needles and the weight of long-held secrets. It was here, according to a cryptic message they had uncovered, that Derek had first encountered the entity, that the curse had taken root. As they drove into town, the setting sun casting long shadows across the deserted streets, Laura couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into the jaws of a trap, that the entity was waiting for them, its unseen presence watching their every move. A veil of mist hung low over the lake, shrouding the old wooden cabin in an ethereal embrace. The silence of the surrounding woods was broken only by the gentle lapping of water against the rickety jetty and the distant cry of a loon. Inside the cabin, Laura and her friends huddled around a flickering fireplace, their faces drawn and pale in the firelight. The weight of their pursuit, the ever-present threat of the entity, pressed down on them like a physical burden. "We're sitting ducks out here," Charlie muttered, his voice tight with tension. "If that thing catches up to us—" He didn't finish his sentence, but the unspoken fear hung heavy in the air. "It's all right, Charlie," Sarah said, her voice surprisingly calm despite the circumstances. "We have a plan." She glanced at Laura, her expression a mixture of concern and determination. "Right, Laura?" Laura nodded, forcing a brave face. The plan had seemed so simple, so foolproof, back in the cramped confines of Megan's car. Lure the entity to the lake, trap it in the water, and use the electrical system from the old boathouse to electrocute it. But now, surrounded by the oppressive silence of the woods, the plan felt reckless, almost suicidal. The air crackled with electricity, both literal and metaphorical, as they set their trap. Charlie, his hands trembling slightly, connected the wires from the boathouse to a network of metal grids submerged just below the surface of the water. Megan double-checked the connections, her brow furrowed in concentration, while Sarah kept watch, her eyes constantly scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. Laura stood at the edge of the jetty, her arms wrapped tightly around her waist, her breath misting in the cool night air. She was the bait, the lure to draw the entity into their trap. Fear, cold and clammy, coiled in her stomach, threatening to overwhelm her. "Are you sure about this, Laura?" Megan asked, her voice barely a whisper. "You don't have to do this. We can figure something else out." Laura shook her head, her throat too tight for words. There was no other way. She had to face her fear, confront the entity for her own sake and for the sake of her friends. Taking a deep breath, Laura stepped onto the rickety wooden platform, her heart pounding in her chest. The old boards creaked ominously beneath her weight, the sound amplified in the stillness of the night. She closed her eyes, focusing on the gentle lapping of the water against the pilings, trying to block out the fear that threatened to consume her. Time seemed to stretch and distort, each second an eternity as Laura waited, her senses on high alert. The silence was broken only by the gentle chirping of crickets and the distant hoot of an owl. And then she felt it. A cold spot in the air, a prickling sensation on the back of her neck, the unmistakable feeling of being watched. Slowly, Laura opened her eyes. The figure stood at the edge of the trees, its outline barely discernible in the darkness. It was tall and imposing, its form shifting and swirling like smoke in the moonlight. It was Derek. No, not Derek. It was wearing Derek's face, a grotesque mockery of the man she thought she had loved. The entity smiled, a slow, predatory grin that sent shivers down Laura's spine. It took a step towards her, then another, its movements fluid and graceful, almost hypnotic. Laura stood frozen, her feet rooted to the spot, her mind screaming at her to run, to escape while she still had the chance. "It's over, Laura," the entity said, its voice a chilling echo of Derek's, yet twisted and distorted, laced with an ancient malice. "There's nowhere left to run, nowhere left to hide." It took another step, and Laura knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that this was it. This was the end. The entity lunged, its arms outstretched, its fingers elongated and gnarled, reaching for her with a hunger that chilled her to the bone. Laura screamed, a primal shriek of terror and defiance, and threw herself backwards, plunging into the icy depths of the lake. The water closed over her head, cold and dark and suffocating. She thrashed wildly, her lungs burning, her limbs heavy and leaden. Vaguely, as if through a thick fog, she heard her friends shouting her name, their voices distant and distorted. And then everything went black. The old British man's voice, filled with a weary sadness, echoed in the darkness. The curse, it seems, is a patient one. It can wait, it can hide, and it will always find a way to claim what it believes is rightfully its own. The screen fades to black, leaving only the haunting image of Laura's hand, reaching up from the depths, her fingers grasping at nothing but the cold, unforgiving darkness. Laura woke with a gasp, coughing up water, her lungs screaming for air. She lay on the wooden planks of the jetty, the rough wood digging into her skin, but she barely noticed. Above her the sky was a bruised canvas of purple and orange, the first light of dawn painting the eastern horizon. She was alive. "Laura!" Megan was kneeling beside her, her face a mask of relief and concern. "You're all right, you're alive!" Charlie and Sarah rushed to her side, their voices a cacophony of relief and concern. Laura sat up, her body aching, her mind still fuzzy from the ordeal. She looked around, her gaze sweeping the shoreline, the tree line, the still surface of the lake. "It's gone," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "He's gone." Her friends exchanged uneasy glances, their relief tinged with a lingering sense of disbelief. None of them had actually seen the entity disappear, but the absence of its oppressive presence was undeniable. The air, once heavy with dread, now felt lighter, almost normal. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Laura allowed herself to hope. Hope that the curse had been broken, that the entity had been vanquished, that their nightmare was finally over. She leaned against Megan, her sister's arms a comforting weight around her shoulders, and closed her eyes, savouring the moment of peace, however fragile it might be. The drive back to the city was a sombre affair. The weight of their experience, the horrifying truth they had uncovered, hung over them like a pall. During their desperate search for answers, they had stumbled upon a name, a connection to the past that sent shivers down their spines. Richard Walker. Laura's father, a man she had always believed to be a loving and devoted husband and parent, had been the first victim of the curse. The entity, they discovered, had once been a woman Richard had wronged, a woman he had driven to despair and ultimately to a desperate act of revenge. The entity, it seemed, was not a mindless monster, but a vengeful spirit, seeking retribution for the sins of the father, a cycle of pain and suffering that had spanned generations. The realization struck Laura like a physical blow. Her own father, the man who had raised her, loved her, had unknowingly condemned her to this living nightmare. Days turned into weeks, the memory of their ordeal at the lake fading into the background noise of their lives. The entity, true to its nature, had retreated into the shadows, its presence no longer a suffocating weight on Laura's shoulders. She had even started seeing someone new, a kind and gentle soul named Mark, who had brought a sense of normalcy back into her life. One cool autumn evening, as Laura and Mark strolled hand in hand through a crowded park, a wave of unease washed over Laura. The feeling was subtle, like a faint whisper on the wind, but unmistakable. She stopped, her hand tightening instinctively around Mark's. "What's wrong?" Mark asked, his brow furrowing with concern. Laura shook her head, trying to dismiss the feeling, but it persisted, a growing sense of dread coiling in her stomach. "Nothing," she said, forcing a smile. "Just thought I saw someone I knew." She glanced over her shoulder, her gaze sweeping the crowd, but there was nothing out of the ordinary. Just couples strolling, children playing, street musicians filling the air with music. And yet the feeling persisted, the unsettling certainty that they were being watched. As they walked away, their footsteps echoing on the pavement, the old British man's voice, filled with a chilling certainty, echoed in the silence. "The curse is patient, it can wait, and it will always find a way to claim what it believes is rightfully its own."